Choi Yoon-jae introduced her to 41 people that night. 41 business partners, lieutenants, city officials, and favored guests moving through the ballroom of his Hanamdong penthouse in deliberate social order. To each of them, he said the same thing. This is Myungja. She handles the household. Not one of them questioned it. Not one of them looked at her for more than 3 seconds. And Myungja, standing in a dress she had sewn herself because nothing in the boutiques he favored was cut for her body, smiled and refilled glasses and made herself invisible in the way she had learned to do. Across 7 years of marriage to a man who found her most useful when she was unseen. 41 introductions. 0 truce. That was the night everything he had built began to move against him, though he would not know it for 11 more days. The wound came from a man named Baek Sung-ho, a senior partner in a Gangnam investment syndicate, who pulled Choi aside near the bar at 11 that evening and said, in a tone of genuine sympathy that was somehow worse than contempt, "You treat your wife like furniture. One day the furniture walks out and you discover the house wasn't standing on its own." 11 words, delivered and then abandoned. Baek returned to his conversation. Choi laughed it off. He would spend the rest of his life measuring time from that sentence. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Myungja left 11 days after the party. She did not slam doors. She did not leave a letter full of grievance. She left a single index card on the kitchen counter weighted with his spare car key, and on it she had written, in the neat, compressed script she used for everything she considered permanent, "I have gone to be seen. Everything else is in order." He read it twice, standing in his bathrobe at 7 in the morning. And his first thought was not fear. His first thought, and he would later understand this as the precise measurement of how far he had fallen, was irritation. He had a lunch that day. She coordinated lunches. He called her phone. It rang 4 times and went to a recording that said simply, "I am not available at this number, not unavailable, not voicemail." A statement. He called again. The same recording. He put the phone down and went to make coffee, and found the coffee already made, kept warm in the machine with a timer she had set, and he drank it standing at the window looking out over the Han River, and thought, she will be back by dinner. She is making a point. He had spent 7 years learning nothing about her, and he applied that nothing generously. She was not back by dinner. She was not back by the following morning. Her closet, when he finally opened it on the 2nd day, was reduced by exactly half, not emptied. Half. The precision of it stopped him in the doorway. She had taken what she needed and left what she did not, and the half she left was arranged to fill the visible space so that at a casual glance nothing appeared missing. He stood there for a long time. Then he went to his desk. The thing about Choi Yoon-jae was that he was genuinely formidable in the domain where he operated. At 43, he controlled a network of 7 legitimate business fronts and 4 shadow operations that moved money and favors across 3 cities with a fluency that most of his competitors spent careers attempting to replicate. He had built this through a specific combination of patience, violence deployed at precise moments, and an almost biological capacity for reading threat. He had survived 4 attempts on his position in the syndicate. He had outlasted 2 national investigations. He had, by any reasonable accounting of his world, won. What he had not done across all of that winning was notice that the infrastructure of his domestic life, which was also the infrastructure of his social credibility among certain partners who valued family as currency, had been built entirely by one person. That person was now gone, and he had no idea how much she had actually done because he had never asked. This is where the first fracture appeared, 3 days after the index card. A message came from Director Im of the Busan Logistics Group, a man who had been close to finalizing a partnership worth 400 million, won over 18 months. The message said in the clipped register of a man withdrawing politely, "We have decided to pause our discussions. We wish you well." That was all. Choi called Director Im's office. He was told the director was in a meeting. He called twice more that day. Meeting, meeting. He sent a message through an intermediary. The intermediary reported back. He said to tell you that his wife sends her regards to yours. He sat with that for an hour. His wife had spoken with Director Im's wife. The two women had met at the party 11 days ago, the party where Myung-ja had served drinks and moved invisibly, and apparently, while doing so, had built something with Mrs. R. Im that Choi had not seen and could not now access. He did not know what Myung-ja had said to Mrs. Im. He did not know what Mrs. Im had said to her husband afterward. He knew only that whatever architecture of relationship had been quietly constructed between the two households, he had no door into it because he had never understood it existed. He called his lieutenant Park Dae-won, a man he had trusted for 9 years, lean and controlled, and always in possession of information before it was needed. Park came to the Hanam-dong apartment that evening and sat across from Choi at the kitchen table, and the first thing he said was, "She sent word to Baek Sung-ho's office." Choi went still. "What kind of word?" "Formal. A message through a third party stating she would be available to meet with Mrs. Baek at a time of Mrs. Baek's choosing, that she had something of interest to share." Choi looked at the coffee machine, still running on its timer. "And Mrs. Baek?" Park's expression did not change. "Accepted within 2 hours." Here is what Choi did not yet understand. Sitting in his kitchen while the city moved outside, in its usual night indifference, his wife had been paying attention for 7 years while he had been performing. She had attended every dinner, every reception, every holiday gathering in a role he had defined as peripheral, and she had used every minute of that peripherality to watch, to listen, to catalog, and to build. She knew which wives were unhappy in which directions. She knew which partnerships were held together by social trust rather than contractual enforcement. She knew who deferred to whom when the men weren't watching and the women were talking. She had, without ever telling him, assembled a map of his world that was in certain critical dimensions more complete than his own. He had handed her this access by making her invisible. Invisible people see everything. He had not considered that. The morning after Park's visit, Choi did something he rarely did. He sat down and tried to reconstruct, from memory and from the household records Myung-ja had kept in meticulous binders in the second drawer of the study desk, exactly what she managed. He opened the first binder. It was labeled simply with the year. Inside, organized by quarter, were records of every vendor relationship for the apartment, every standing appointment, every contact person for every service they used, annotated in her handwriting with notes about payment preferences, personal details she had learned, the names of children, small loyalties she had maintained. He opened the second binder. Social calendar, cross-referenced against his professional calendar, with notes about which guests required what kind of acknowledgement, which relationships needed tending, and how. He opened the third. He stopped at the third. The third binder was not household management. The third binder was something else entirely. He did not read it fully that morning. He closed it and held his hand on the cover for a long time. The gray morning light falling flat through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city below him carrying on without reference to what he had just touched. Something was in that binder that was not meant to be found. He understood this in the way he understood most danger. As a physical sensation before it was a thought, he put the binder back in the drawer. He went and stood at the window. He thought about Baek Sung-ho's 11 words. Then he called Park and said, "Find her." Park was the best finder Choi had ever employed. He ran a network of quiet contacts across Seoul and 3 other cities, and his method was never pressure, but rather observation. He followed the logic of a person rather than their physical trail, and he was rarely wrong. He came back 48 hours later and sat down across from Choi and said, "She is in Gyeongju. I know the district. I do not know the specific location." Choi said, "How did you find the district?" Park said, and there was something in his delivery that Choi would later identify as the faintest possible rehearsal. "She used a bank transfer. Gyeongju branch." Choi nodded. He did not ask why a woman of Myungja's organizational precision would leave a traceable bank transfer when she had planned her departure so carefully that her closet looked full. He did not ask. He filed the question in the back of his mind and moved forward. Because moving forward was what he knew how to do. He was already in motion, already inside the logic of recovery, already thinking about the Busan partnership and the Bake meeting and what needed to be repaired and how, and the question of why the bank transfer was visible did not fit the momentum he was building, so he did not ask it. This was his failure. Stated plainly, he analyzed threat but not source. He managed consequence but did not sit with cause. He would spend the drive to Gyeongju rearranging his approach when he should have been rereading the index card. He drove himself. This was unusual. Choi almost never drove himself anywhere, having spent 15 years building a life in which solitude was a resource to be spent, not inhabited. But he wanted to think without being observed, and thinking without being observed required being alone, and being alone required driving. He left Seoul at 6 a.m, the city still gray and damp in the way of late autumn, the elevated roads reflecting the sky back in long, wet ribbons. He drove south and east through 4 hours of landscape that changed gradually from the compressed density of the capital to something more open and horizontal. And somewhere in that transition, he pulled off the highway and sat in a rest area parking lot for 20 minutes and did something he almost never did. He tried to remember the last time he had. Asked Myungja how she was. Not how things were. Her, he could not find it. He tried to go back 1 year. 2. He could not find a single specific instance. The silence of that was not melodramatic. It was just a fact. He sat with it like a stone and then pulled back onto the highway. He arrived in Gyeongju before noon and called the number Park had given him for a local contact. The contact was a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Seo, who ran a small cultural archive near the historic district, a person Choi had never met and could not imagine how she connected to Myungja. When he reached her office, a single-room space, packed with folded documents and the smell of old paper, she looked at him for a long time before speaking. Then she said, "She told me you might come." "She said you would come when you ran out of other options," Choi said. "She left me a way to find her." Mrs. Seo nodded. "She left you a way to find the truth. Whether you find her depends on what you do with it." She handed him a small sealed envelope. "He asked me to give you this and then ask you to leave. She said you would know why the instruction mattered." He took the envelope. He left. He sat in his car and opened it. Inside was a single folded page, and on it was an address, not in Gyeongju, but in Daejeon, a city 3 hours northwest, and a name, Professor Hwang. Below the name, in Myunja's neat, compressed script, 3 words, "He kept records." Choi looked at the address for a long time. He thought about the 3rd binder. He thought about Baek Sung-ho's 11 words, and the way they had been delivered was sympathy rather than cruelty, which meant Baek had known something and was choosing a form of warning that Choi was equipped to dismiss. Then he drove north. He reached Daejeon by mid-afternoon. Professor Hwang turned out to be a retired accounting academic, 71 years old, precise and unhurried, with a study full of sorted files and a manner that suggested he had long since stopped being impressed by powerful men. He offered tea. Choi sat. Hwang set a manila folder on the table between them and said, "Your wife spent 3 months verifying this. She brought me the raw documents. I agreed to examine them because I know her work and I trust her methodology." He paused. "I do not know you," Choi said. "What is in the folder?" Huang said, "Proof that someone in your organization has been selling your client relationships to a competing syndicate for 14 months, not broadly, selectively. The ones where the primary trust connection was social rather than contractual, the ones your wife maintained." Choi did not move. 14 months. Huang nodded. 41 individual transactions that I can document. I expect the actual number is higher. 41, the same number as the introductions at the party. Choi wondered if Myung-ja had chosen that coincidence deliberately, or if the mathematics of his blindness simply repeated itself. He opened the folder and read for 40 minutes while Professor Huang sat across the room and drank his tea and waited, with the patience of a man who had nothing left to prove. The documents were what Ma Young-ja's binders always were, meticulous, cross-referenced, annotated in the same neat handwriting that had recorded the names of vendors' children and the payment preferences of kitchen suppliers. She had been building this file for 3 months. She had been watching for longer. She had not told him, because she had not yet trusted what he would do with it, which was, Choi recognized slowly, an accurate assessment of who he had been when she was watching him. The name in the documents was Park Dae-won. He sat with that for a very long time. The afternoon light moved across Professor Huang's study in slow amber slabs, the old radiator ticking, the street outside carrying the sounds of a mid-sized city going about its business. 9 years. He had trusted Park for 9 years. Park had found him clients and solved problems and been present at every critical moment, and apparently across 14 of the last 18 months had been feeding the relational structure of those clients, the social trust that Myung-ja had built and maintained, to a competing organization called the Daewha Group. Not the contracts, the relationships, the human infrastructure. Because that was the part that couldn't be protected with lawyers. That was the part that only Myung-ja had maintained, which meant only Park had known how central she was. Park had known before Choi did. He understood now why the bank transfer had been visible. Ma Young-ja had known he would tell Park he was looking. She had given Park a false location. So that when Choi arrived in Gyeongju and found Mrs. Seo and eventually followed the trail to Daejeon, he would do it without Park knowing. She had routed him away from his own lieutenant on purpose. She had factored Park into the architecture of her departure. The woman he had introduced to 41 people as the Maid had been running a counterintelligence operation inside his house for 3 months while serving coffee and being invisible. He drove back toward Seoul with the folder on the passenger seat and called no one. He needed to think without Park intercepting. He needed to understand the full shape of what Ma Young-ja had built before he could use it without destroying it. She had given him the evidence, but not the instruction. She had left him to make the choice about what kind of man he wanted to be when no one was watching, and the mechanism was already in his hands. He thought about this for the entire 3-hour drive. The night coming down across the highway, the lights of oncoming traffic strobing across his face in the dark. He stopped once at a rest area outside of Xianan and sat and thought about the third binder. The one he had not fully read, he had closed it and put it back. He had left evidence in his own house because looking at it completely had felt like the beginning of a consequence he wasn't ready for. He had made a choice not to know which was, he recognized now, precisely the choice he had been making for 7 years in relation to the person who had compiled it. He pulled back onto the highway. He reached Seoul at 9 in the evening, went to the apartment, went directly to the study, took out the third binder, and sat down and read all of it. It took him 2 hours. When he finished, he knew 3 things with certainty. First, Park had been working for the Daewha Group for at least 14 months. Second, the Daewha Group's principal operative contact with Park was a man named Jung, who Choi had met twice at industry events and found unremarkable, which was apparently the point. Third, Myung-ja had documentation sufficient for a formal complaint to the Financial Services Commission, which regulated the legitimate front businesses, and to the National Tax Service, which had been quietly building a separate case against the Daewoo Group for 18 months. She had not filed anything. She had assembled the tools and left them for him. She had protected his organization from collapse while he was busy, not noticing her. She had protected the people who worked for him, the 30-some legitimate employees of his front companies who knew nothing of his shadow operations and would lose their livelihoods if the whole structure fell. She had done it because of them, not because of him. He understood this with a clarity that was close to shame, but harder than shame, more specific. He called his attorney at 11, that night, not Park. His attorney was a woman named Cho, who had worked with him for 6 years and who was one of the very few people in his professional orbit who had always spoken plainly with him. He said, "I need to know the process for bringing a regulatory complaint to the FSC and a parallel notification to the NTS that simultaneously provides cooperation and limits exposure for legitimate operations." Cho was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This exists, but it requires a primary complainant with documented standing, a person who can demonstrate direct knowledge." Choi said, "The documents are already assembled." Cho said, "By whom?" Choi said, "By my wife." Another pause, longer. Then Cho said, "I see. I will need to see everything." He emailed the scanned documents at midnight. He did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the coffee machine running on its timer, the one Myung-ja had set before she left, and thought about parallel architectures. She had built one in plain sight. The household management, the social relationships, the vendor network. She had built one in secret, the documentation, the chain of evidence, the route to Professor Huang and Mrs. Seo. And she had apparently thought through what happened after, because the moment Choi filed anything with the FSC, the Daewoo Group would know he had documentation. The question was how Park would respond. A man who had been methodically selling trust for 14 months was a man who had planned for the possibility of exposure. The question was whether he had planned for it sooner or whether he believed, as most people believed, that Myung-ja was merely domestic. He found out the answer the next morning. Park arrived at the apartment at 8, which was not unusual. He let himself in with his key, which was not unusual. He sat down across from Choi at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "You went to Gyeongju and then Daejeon. I know you didn't find her in Gyeongju." He was not performing. He was calibrating. "You found something in Daejeon." Choi looked at him across the table for a very long time. Then he said, 9 years. Park said, 14 months. There's a distinction. Choi said, "I'm listening." And he was. For perhaps the first time in a long time, he was actually listening to someone rather than deciding ahead of their words what the words would mean. Park said, "Daewoo came to me 18 months ago. They weren't buying your business. They were building a case for leverage, collecting evidence of your shadow operations through the relational back channels your wife managed, because your wife was the only person outside the formal structure who had full visibility. They wanted the information she held. They came to me because they assumed I had access to what she knew." He paused. "I gave them surface relationships. I gave them nothing she had actually built. I thought, managing them." Choi said, "You were feeding them." Park said, "I was feeding them what I controlled, which was less than they thought and less than you think." A silence. "The 41 transactions the professor found." Park said, 41 surface introductions, names, social, calendars, things your wife had shared with you in writing, nothing she held in her head. They know by now they got the catalog, not the inventory. Choi sat with this. It was possible Park was telling a partial truth to manage the crisis. It was possible He was telling the full truth and had made a calculation that Daewha had miscalculated, and the exit was disclosure. It was possible he had known Myung-ja was building the file and had decided to surface now rather than be surfaced later. All three possibilities could be true simultaneously. He said, "What does Daewha do when they find out I have the full documentation?" Park said, "They move not away toward." He looked at his hands. Jung was at a meeting with Chairman O of the Seogang group yesterday. I found out this morning. They're trying to position for a hostile takeover of your legitimate holdings using a debt instrument they purchased 3 months ago from one of your secondary creditors. They don't need to destroy you. They just need your board to believe you're compromised. Choi said, "How long do they need?" Park said, "The board meeting for Seogang crossholder confirmation is in 4 days. 4 days. He needed to move faster than Daewha's paperwork and slower than his own anger. He needed to know which board members were wavering and why, and he needed something he currently did not have, a reason for those board members to believe his word over a competing offer. He needed the one thing he had spent 7 years systematically failing to demonstrate, that he was the kind of person who could be trusted with things that mattered to someone else. He called Cho first. He told her to begin preparing the FSC filing and to document the timeline with maximum specificity. He told her to notify the NTS of cooperative intent and request a 48-hour window for a formal, voluntary submission, which would give him legal standing to flag Daehwa's debt instrument as connected to an active regulatory proceeding. She said she needed 12 hours. He told her she had 8. Then he called Director Im in Busan. He called him directly, not through an intermediary, and when Im answered surprised, Choi said, "I owe you a conversation and an apology that you can verify or dismiss as you see fit. I would prefer to give it directly." A pause. Im said, "I'm listening." Choi said, "My wife has spent 7 years making your trust in me possible. I spent those years pretending otherwise, including to myself. She has now left, which is her right, and she has left me documentation that I am about to use in a way that protects the interests of every party she valued in our network, including yours. I am asking for 72 hours before you make any final decision about the Daewha approach." Im was quiet for a moment. "She contacted my wife." Choi said, "I know. I don't know what she said." Im said, "She said you were worth the 72 hours. She said she wouldn't have married you if you weren't, and she doesn't make mistakes like that lightly." Choi closed his eyes. "Thank you," Im said. "Talk to your wife." Then he said he would hold for 72 hours. He called 3 other partners in the same direct manner across the next 2 hours. Assemblyman Wu, who controlled a crossover vote in the regulatory committee, Mrs. Baek's office to arrange a conversation with Chairman Baek himself, and a man named Roh in Incheon who had a long institutional memory of the Daehwa Group's prior maneuvering and reasons of his own to want them constrained. Each call was different in detail and identical in architecture, honest, specific, without performance. He made no promises he would not be able to keep. He named Myung-ja plainly in each conversation. He said what she had built. He said what he had failed to see. He did not sentimentalize it. He stated it as fact. Stated facts, he had begun to understand, were the only currency that actually held value when everything else was in motion. Attorney Cho filed at 6 the following morning. By 7:30, the NTS had acknowledged the cooperative submission and issued a preliminary flag on the Daehwa debt instrument, which triggered a procedural hold that any board vote referencing that instrument would have to acknowledge. It was not permanent, it was not even guaranteed to hold, but it was a clock consumption mechanism, a deliberate use of process to create friction in Daehwa's timeline, and friction was what he needed. He needed Daehwa moving slower than their plan and faster than their patience. Jung, the operative, responded by 11 that morning, not to Choi. to Park. A message relayed through two intermediaries requesting a meeting to clarify the situation before escalation. Park brought the message and sat across the table and said, "He thinks I'm still his." Choi said, "What does he think you'll do?" Park said, "Negotiate your surrender." Choi said, "Tell him you need 24 hours. Park looked at him. "You want me to buy time." Choi said, "I want you to do what you should have done 14 months ago, which is use information advantage to protect this organization instead of drain it. Yes, buy time." Park sent the message. Jung accepted the 24-hour cooling period, which told Choi that Jung was uncertain that the regulatory filing had landed somewhere he had not anticipated and that he was waiting for intelligence from Park before deciding whether to accelerate or reframe. This was the gap. Choi had 24 hours in which the Daewoo group believed they still had an inside source, and in which that source was now actually working for him. He used 14 of those 24 hours to drive to Daejeon Park outside Professor Wong's neighborhood and wait. He had called Mrs. Saber, Seo and Youngju the previous evening and asked her a single question. "Does she know what I've done with what she left me?" Mrs. Seo said. "She will," he said. "Tell her what I've done, all of it. And tell her I'm asking to see her, not to persuade her." To show her, Mrs. Seo said she would. The morning after the filing, he drove. She found him. That was the thing. He was sitting on a bench in a small park, 2 blocks from Huang's archive, the late autumn cold settling through his coat, when she came around the corner and sat down beside him without announcement. She had cut her hair since the party. She was wearing her own clothes, the kind she chose when he was not setting the context, a dark wool coat, flat shoes, no performance in any of it. She sat down and looked at the bare-branched trees and did not speak first. He said after a long time, "You built 3 separate mechanisms. The documentation, the false location for Park, the connections to Im's wife and Mrs. Bach. You ran them simultaneously." She said, "I had time." "You gave me a lot of time by not needing me for anything I found interesting." He sat with that. Then he said, "I am sorry, specifically for the 41 introductions, for every introduction before that night that went the same way." She said, "I know you are." She paused. "I need to know what you do with sorry," he said. "I don't know yet. I know it requires something I haven't demonstrated." She looked at him for the first time since sitting down. "Attention," she said. "Not management, not arrangement. Attention, those are different things." He said, "I know," she said. "You just learned the difference. That's not the same as having practiced it." He said, "No, it isn't." They sat in the cold for a while, neither moving. She said the 34 employees in the legitimate operations. He said, "Protected. The filing structure Cho used puts them outside the exposure perimeter." She said, "I know. I wrote the structure." He looked at her. "You anticipated the FSC approach." She said, "I anticipated several approaches. I wrote structures for 3 of them. Cho found the one that worked." He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the specific recognition of a person finally seeing something that had been there all along. He said, "What made you build it for 3 scenarios?" She said, "I pay attention. I don't pre-decide what matters. Something you do. Something you're aware of now." He said, "Yes." She said, "The awareness isn't enough." He said, "I know." She said, "Then we agree on the problem." She did not say she was coming back. He did not ask her to. They sat on the bench in Daejeon while the light changed from the flat gray of mid-morning to the slightly warmer gray of noon, and they talked not about what had happened, which was fully documented and required no narration, but about what came next, specifically, conditionally, with the unsentimental plainness of 2 people who had moved past the performance of a relationship into something more demanding. She had conditions. He accepted them without negotiating the terms, which was the first competent thing he had done in the emotional register of their marriage. She said there would be a period not defined in advance during which she would observe whether the changes he named were changes he actually made. He said, "How long?" She said, "Until I know." He said, "That's not a timeline." She said, "No, it isn't. Get used to ambiguity. It's what trust actually feels like before it's proven." He returned to Seoul the next day. Park had held the 24-hour clock. Jung had come to the meeting expecting a negotiation and found, instead, that Park had already provided the recorded communications between himself and Jung's operatives to Cho's office as part of a voluntary supplementary filing. Jung found himself in a conversation that had already been documented. He left the meeting and drove to Incheon, apparently to consult with someone in the Daewoo hierarchy, and was located at a small hotel near the port 2 days later by a contact of Rose, who had made his own calls. He was not arrested. Choi had no interest in the public spectacle of arrest. The regulatory mechanism was already moving. The debt instrument had been flagged. Daewoo's board had begun a quiet, internal review that Choi's attorney had made sure the relevant regulators knew about. Jung's leverage was gone because the thing it depended on, Park's hidden loyalty, had been taken off the board. Park tendered a formal separation from Choi's organization 3 days later. Choi accepted it. Not with contempt, not with generosity, but with the clean, neutral acknowledgement of a transaction whose terms were understood by both sides. Park had done damage and then, when given the choice between acceleration and redress, had chosen redress. That was a fact. It did not restore the 9 years to what they had been before Daewoo arrived, but it placed the final 14 months in a context that was not simply betrayal. Choi let it be complicated. He did not resolve it into a simpler story. The board meeting for the Seogang crossholder confirmation happened 5 days later than originally scheduled, delayed by the procedural hold. By the time it occurred, Chairman Baek had made 3 calls to wavering board members, not on Choi's behalf specifically, but in support of maintaining established relationships over opportunistic disruption, which had the same practical effect. Director Im had returned his call and formalized the Busan partnership in writing. Assemblyman Woo had made a statement to the regulatory committee that characterized the FSC filing as evidence of an organization with internal compliance mechanisms functioning as intended. It was a generous framing. It was the kind of framing that required someone to make the call. He had made the call and been specific and honest, and specificity and honesty turned out to be the mechanism that worked when performance had spent its credibility. The board confirmed the existing ownership structure. Daewoo's instrument was referred to a separate proceeding. Jung's name appeared in the preliminary filings. The Daewoo Group's principal responded by beginning a restructuring of their own, which had nothing to do with Choi directly except that it occupied the attention of the people who had been positioning against him. 2 weeks later, Choi stood at the podium of the Seogang Quarterly Partners Gathering. 47 people in the room, the same kind of room in which he had performed for 41 guests 11 days before all of this began. He had prepared remarks about the quarter's performance. He set them aside. He said, without notes, looking at the room, "I want to correct something. 7 years of something. There is a person who has maintained every relational connection in this network that has held through pressure, and I have introduced her to most of you as the person who runs my household. Both of those things are true. What I failed to say, what I failed to know how to say, what I was too occupied with my own management of impressions to say, is her name and what she actually does. Her name is Myungja. She is my wife. She kept this network human when I was keeping it efficient. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between them is what you trust when you need to trust something that isn't in writing." He stopped. The room was quiet. He said, "That's the correction." He stepped back from the podium. He did not look for applause. She was not in the room. She was in Daejeon, or she was somewhere between Daejeon and wherever she decided to be next. She was not back. That was the correct word. Not yet back. The yet was load-bearing. He had put it there with his eyes open, and he intended to earn it across an undefined period of demonstrated change, rather than a single public statement, because she had told him that attention and management were different things. And he had decided she was right in the specific way that only people who have been wrong for a very long time can recognize rightness when they finally sit still long enough to hear it. There is an aphorism he found in the fourth binder, the last of the four she had left in the second drawer of the study desk. He had opened it the morning after the partners' gathering, expecting more documentation. It was not documentation. It was a private journal, the kind that was not meant to be found, but was left with the other binders because she had decided finally that being known was more important than being protected from misreading. The aphorism was from something she had read in the second year of their marriage, copied in her neat handwriting into the front cover. The one who pays attention owns the room, even when no one hands them the key. She had underlined it once, not twice. Once was enough. He had been handed every key in every room he had ever entered. He had opened every door and named the room as his and arranged its contents and called this management. She had walked into rooms where she was handed nothing and seen everything, and built quietly, and been correct. He had introduced her to 41 people as household staff. She had already known things about those 41 people that he would spend the rest of his life trying to learn. The furniture had walked out. The house had begun to show its actual structure for the first time, and the actual structure was her work. The yet was load-bearing. He kept the aphorism on the kitchen table, not framed, not announced, just present. The page folded to show the line, weighted with the same car key she had left on the index card. He walked past it every morning on the way to the coffee machine, which still ran on the timer she had set. He had not changed the timer. He told himself this was because he hadn't gotten around to it. He told himself this for approximately 4 days before admitting that it was because the timer was the last scheduled thing she had done for him, and he was not ready to replace it with his own. Not yet. Not until he had earned the right to set a new one together. The phone rang one morning, 3 weeks after the partners' gathering. He answered it. She said, "I'm coming to Seoul for 2 days. I want to see what you've changed." He said, "2 days isn't enough to see everything." She said, "I know. It's enough to see whether you started." He said, "I started." She said, "Then I'll see you Thursday." He said, "Thursday." She said, "Don't arrange anything." He understood what she meant. Do not prepare a performance. Do not set the stage. Let her see the actual room. He said, "I won't." She said, "Good." She hung up. He stood at the window looking at the river, the same window he had stood at the morning she left, and the city looked exactly the same as it had looked then, gray and wide and indifferent, and he was entirely different inside it, which was not a triumph but a beginning, conditional, unsentimentally earned, the only kind that lasts. The one who pays attention owns the room. He had spent 43 years walking through rooms he did not own, collecting the keys. And he was 43 now, which meant the entirety of his life had been spent this way. He was, for the first time, learning to stand still long enough to see what was actually there. Thursday was 4 days away. He had 4 days to practice being a different person in the same apartment. He spent the first of those 4 days reading everything she had left in the binders that he had not read carefully the first time, not for information now, but for the experience of reading her, of encountering the way her mind moved and what she noticed and what she cared enough to write down. He found on page 37 of the second binder a note about him. 5 words in the margin, in a different color ink than the surrounding entries, written from the date of the entry in the 3rd year of their marriage. He could be the one. She had never said it to him. She had written it in the margin of a household record and left it there for 8 years as a private hope and a private reckoning. He turned the page. Then he went back and read it again. He did not need it to be more than what it was. What it was enough.